and dying in your beds many years from now, would you be willing to trade all the days from this day to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and tell our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom?
To Anti-Tyranny News Radio here on UCY.tv. Thank you for joining me this evening. Had some technical difficulties this past Wednesday. Sorry about that. Give everybody an update on my dog. She is done with the radiation treatment along with CBD oil. I've basically been told, oh, it's a miracle. I think along with the CBD oil, that radiation actually was able to do what it needed to do. Even though I'm very iffy about that type of stuff. Of course, chemo was completely not an option. That's from me personally. I do not do the whole chemo thing. But she is doing very, very well. And again, I'm going to continue CBD oil treatments to try to prevent any tumor growth or anything like that. But so far, everything's been really good. And I'm going to take her this Wednesday to have another checkup in the morning. And we'll see how that checkup, how they perceive everything. But this Friday, I kind of wanted to cover a couple things that have been in the news, and I'll touch on the school shooting here at the end of the broadcast. I really don't want to cover that right away, but one thing I do want to get into, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is the whole Israel-Palestine mess that's, well, it's been going on forever, but we'll get into that because I've seen misreporting or uninformed reporting coming from not only mainstream media, but even alternative media, alternative outlets that I actually have respect for because they usually know what they're talking about, but because I've been, going back and forth, I haven't been able to get a lot of things done, around my house and helping out my family. But I had actually watched live streams coming in from Palestine and Israel, and with how much live streams there were available, and a lot of it came from smaller or alternative media outlets and, even citizen journalists, I think that no one, mainstream or alternative, has put the full truth out there. And me being me, I do not take a side on the issue. I have a lot of issues with Israel, and I have a lot of issues with Hamas and Palestine. But my issues with those groups are separate from my heart that goes out to people on both sides that really aren't involved in all the fighting. They're just like you and me, just trying to live our lives, not trying to really get completely involved. I'm not really much of an activist. I kind of started out in the activist scene back in 06, 07, and I kind of quickly turned my attention more commentary and more of just a reporting stance because of these issues. Because when you start aligning with certain groups, even though I'll put praise out there for things that groups do that I believe that are just and, truthful and a good thing. But at the same time, I'll call out the same groups when they're doing the opposite of what I believe is right and truthful. And that's why I kind of transitioned from more of an activist to more of a commentary. And behind the scenes, I do kind of, people like to pick my brain. Outside of, radio or social media, but out in the real world, people like to pick my brain because I honestly don't know. They think I'm smart or something. I don't know. And really, it's just, I like to look at both sides of an issue, and I really lean back on my ideology, my philosophy, my beliefs, and freedom and liberty. I don't really sway too far from that. I base most everything on those, including with my own employer outside of radio. I work outside of doing this, and I base all of even my work on my ideology, my philosophy. So I even have battles with the owner of the company over things like this. Whether it be wages or hours worked, my time is money. Even though the company decides what wage is, I know my worth, and I've worked my butt off to know how to do things, to understand things. Therefore, I hold leverage. Yes, you can fire me. You can go get someone else. But when I'm able to basically do what you would have to hire 3 people to do, I hold leverage. Therefore, in a sense, I tend to make up my own hours, other than I do work weekends, but I also work days during the week. And if I go in and I work harder than others, I will leave early. Because you're basically holding me to a different standard than you're holding other people. Therefore, I hold that as leverage. But we'll kind of get more into the news here. Not me. One thing that I want to cover first is something that was brought to my attention because I've kind of been out of the loop and I've kind of asked people to, hey, kind of throw me, articles or anything that I'm missing because I've been literally traveling across the state back and forth and just trying to keep my own house in order. I haven't really had the time other than when the U.S. Embassy opened. I was able to pull multiple live streams that, some of them went 15 minutes, some of them went half hour. I've had live streams that went a couple hours. But again, we'll get into that whole deal. And that's one that I personally was able to try to watch, listen, and really understand it because I do have issues with both sides, which I do with multiple things. I consider myself libertarian in my ideology, but I do have a lot of issues with a lot of people that consider themselves libertarian. But one thing that was brought to my attention was the EU basically was the EU trying to bully, pressure, and a call for backing away from the U.S. when it comes to Trump pulling out of the Iran deal. And I want to start off with this clip from Ron Paul. It's the Ron Paul Liberty Report. He also kind of touches on Gaza and which, if you know, Iran and Hamas kind of bleed together in issues. And I really want to get to this because honestly, I don't think that we should work with the EU. If I want to deal with France, and more importantly, if I want to deal with someone that lives in France, that's between me and that person that lives in France. But most importantly, when the U.S. deals with the country, they need to deal with the country, not some arbitrary, non-elected body that claims authority over multiple countries. Kind of the same problem we have with the United Nations, which I haven't seen a lot of that anymore, which kind of upsets me that we're not, calling for the breakup of the United Nations anymore as much as we used to. If you remember back to 06, 07, 08, 09, 2010, 2011, it was, there was a strong activism against it. And we have the EU, which is just basically a whole bunch of unelected people that make decisions for multiple countries and claims authority over those countries and their military. And same with the UN. We have these problems with this, but we're seeing less pressure, and because, mainstream and even some alternative media outlets have really backed away from it. But one thing that really kind of inspired me some more was the simple fact that Ron Paul really, because like me, everything's based on our ideology, our beliefs and freedom. And he touches on this in a way where he talks about, the EU breaking up with Washington and Trump over the Iran deal is good blowback, and I really think it is. I'm not a nationalist, but I'm also not a globalist. I think globalism is worse than nationalism, but both nationalism and globalism, in the sense of governmental control, is dangerous and unethical and goes against freedom of the individual. So I'm happy to bring you this Ron Paul Liberty report over this issue, calling it good blowback. So let's go ahead and get into that, and we'll dive into the specific issues right after this.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you.
How are you this morning, Dr. Paul?
I'm doing very well. Good to have you here, because I wouldn't know what to do if I didn't have some help, you know. No, but it is good to have you here for another program, another episode, and we have a lot of anxious people who tune in, you know, at 11 o'clock Central Time, and that's very good.
Our good friends.
And we're always anxious to hear from them, and we do hear from them. Most of it's all good, but every once in a while we have those people who like to pick a little bit. But we want to talk about blowback. We've talked about blowback all the way back to 2007 when we talked about blowback in a very negative sense about bad stuff. But here we're talking about maybe some beneficial blowback. Of course, that depends on from whose view you're looking at it from. You know, from our view, it can't be all bad on what's happening. I want to read a couple headlines to sort of set the stage for what we're going to be talking about. On your Zero Hedge, they had something this morning that says, European leaders revolt against U.S. sanctions in bid to preserve Iran deal. Of course, that was predicted, and we talked about it, and most people think, well, it can't be serious. We're the kingpins, and they won't ever do it, and they won't be able to. Who knows? You know, when push comes to shove, maybe, and that's been my argument over the years, we have built up a lot of enemies that will be willing to stand up to us if they see a weakness in an opening. And right now they're pretty hacked off at us for what we did, because the Europeans are probably going to be sanctioned as much as the Iranians are. This literally is putting sanctions on Europe, not just our enemies like in Iran. But there's another quote from AFP News. I want to read this. It says, EU leaders met their counterparts from 6 Balkan countries for summit talks at Sofia, a day after dinner that sought to forge a united front in face of U.S. President Trump's capricious assertiveness on Iran nuclear deal and trade tariffs. And I read also that European leader was quoted as saying, you know, we have to realize that Trump does not respect weakness. So regardless of how they may have thought years ago in dealing diplomatically, it's in their mind, we can't look weak. And if it's just a charade, that's okay. But I think they're serious about it, and I don't think they want to look weak. So if they say something, I think they're more serious than they have been in the past.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we both, when we were talking about it before the show, we were kind of raising our hands happily, because it is kind of a silver lining from our perspective to see this emerging rift, this emerging split between the U.S. and EU. It can only be good news for us, non-interventionists. But this has actually come out in the open, because Donald Tusk, the president of the EU president, had a tweet, and I think we have it here, we can bring it up. He is not holding back. Look at what he tweeted. He said, looking at latest decisions of Donald Trump, someone could even think, with friends like that, who needs enemies? But frankly, the EU should be grateful. Thanks to him, we got rid of all illusions. We realize if you need a helping hand, you will find one at the end of your arm.
There you go.
Applause. It's great news. They're frustrated. They're upset with the way the Trump administration does its foreign policy. We are too, in a way, but in this case, it's actually turned out to have kind of a silver lining.
Right. And, there's another article, and we've talked about this many times, about what will this ever do to the dollar. So far, it hasn't done a thing. The dollar, matter of fact, has been going down for a long time, but the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's been going up. So this recent news hasn't hurt, but we continue to hear the news, and because they can't undermine a reserve currency overnight, it's what happens long term on a currency. But there's a headline, the EU to ditch dollar for Iranian oil. And the Iranians are always looking for a way to sell their oil. And I think they have had one contract written. So that is still out in the news. And that is something that our government never ignores, because we have to have the military power to run the empire, but we also have to control the world fiat currency, because you don't control a gold standard unless you're abusing it. But when you have a fiat standard, the control is everything, and the control is, of course, the Federal Reserve plus the deep state. Mm-hmm. They serve more people than just the 12 people in the Federal Reserve. It's the people who need the money, which means all the bankers are involved. So this is a big thing if there's a challenge to the dollar, because there's been many times that we've talked about it. It had probably something to do with getting rid of Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi, and even it to some degree is involved in Syria. But I think this is persistent, and if they just even nibble away at it, because right now there's a lot of contracts still written in dollars, and they probably will go through. I mean, it isn't the end of that like tomorrow. But that long term, I think, is significant. So I think we're going to be reading and trying to understand fully what the ramifications have been on this breakdown of this agreement, and how Trump is going to handle it. That makes all the difference in the world. Now, the Europeans look at Trump and said, he doesn't like weakness, and we better not appear weak. But in some ways, some of them might get a little bit of encouragement, because Trump is this, and then all of a sudden he'll back off. I mean, look, not too long ago, it was bomb in North Korea. And now he's talking, but now we don't know where we are now that we have Bolton involved there. But it's something that I think we're going to be looking at for a long time, the ramification, because that was a major move. Everybody was warned about it. In this instance, Trump was consistent in his announcement during the campaign, and that was to void that agreement and get us out of it. So we have a long way to go to smooth this over.
I wanted to go back to something you said earlier that I've been fascinated, and I don't understand well enough, and I know you understand it much better than I do, but the possibility of Iran and the EU trading in euros, selling oil in euros rather than the dollar. Do you think that's possible, or do you think it would be significant if they were able to make that shift?
Oh, I really think so, because on occasion you have a sale, but the people who control the international banking system is the United States and the dollar. And of course, we had this major agreement back after World War II with the Saudis, that they would agree, and they were essentially the producers of the world, that they would always sell their oil in dollars. But the world has changed now. And no, I think it's very feasible. I think they're preparing for it. The Chinese would like a Chinese oil yuan, and they're working in that direction. So yes, I think that's going to happen. The only thing that I would like to see happen, if the Europeans get really upset and want to smooth things over, they shouldn't be hostile to Russia. I mean, they have to. It is the United States that's driving the hostility. And I think the hostility we heard about, over Ukraine and others coming from Europe, was orchestrated by us. But then you have to factor in again the NATO issue. NATO would be weakened by an independent EU. But then again, we may cheer about this and seeing this as a good division, and maybe just let our troops come home. But the whole thing is I've never believed the European Union is so good. I mean, we were cheering the British when they got out, the European Union. And here now they're talking about going to the Balkans and trying to get new members in there. There's the people who want to do that. And the Balkans want in, but I'm sure they don't want in to come and help defend the United States.
That is interesting because that is a shift. And NATO EU is also splitting in a way because of that. NATO went in there fast and got the Balkans. Albania is a member. Montenegro was the most recent member, a country that doesn't contribute anything substantial to NATO's ability as a military alliance. But then you have the EU, and this is, in fact, you started out the show with this comment, this summit down in Sofia. Well, Jean-Claude Juncker, who's the EU Commission chief, here's what he said down there. Without a European perspective, the Balkans risk falling back to the misfortunes we saw in the 1990s. So there's clearly, I think, an EU push toward the Balkans, not necessarily for membership right away, because there's a lot of problems, financial being one of them. But, we had a piece that we put on our website that Jim Jatras, who we mentioned yesterday, our friend, did about how some Beltway think tanks are also saying, we got to get the Balkans in. It's time for action in the Western Balkans. Was a think tank report from a couple of Beltway think tanks. So I think this is sort of shaping up to be a battlefield, so to speak, between EU and the U.S. for the Balkans. And the wild card player really is Russia, who is going to make the first steps toward rapprochement with Russia.
Yeah, and we were very pleased to see Yugoslavia break up because, they should have this independence. And it almost looks like they're reversing that. Instead of a Soviet Yugoslavia, it looks like it might become a European Yugoslavia, and they'll have to toe the line, and the people who would come in would have to follow the rules of EU, which is the antagonism that so many countries already don't like because they get involved in their budgets and deficits and that sort of thing. But I think that there's a good chance that this will move along, but I think that we have to realize the European Union isn't the answer. My suggestion is very simple, a dream that I always have, which will probably remain a dream forever, except for the fact that there was something that is referred to as Hong Kong, which was at a time in the midst of the most vicious Cold War ever, existed, and they acted like libertarians, essentially, and they traded because it was necessary, East and West trading with each other, and it was very wealthy. I don't know whether it exists now, but there was a time when when Hong Kong was as rich as all of China, on what? Wouldn't it be neat if one of these countries, you've spent some time over in that area, pick a country and find out which one leans most to libertarianism and say, no, we're not interested in NATO, we're not interested in the EU. What we're interested in is setting an example and keeping our people free, and we're going to introduce this sound currency and the principles of a free market. And all they want to be is left alone. That would be the hitch. Will the Americans leave them alone? Will the Europeans leave them alone? Will the Russians leave them alone? Who knows what would happen? But that would be the solution to that, and teach them to believe that a little independence, but a loose association. Yeah, a loose association, in that area is fine and dandy, but independence is not a bad idea, too.
Yeah, in fact, the scenario you're pointing to did take place. It took place in Albania in about 1993. Albania was the most repressive of the communist regimes, and they literally had no economy. And in 93, when it opened up, I was down there, and there were so many little stalls people opened up. The government was really non-existent. It hadn't developed yet, and so people were buying and selling and trading, and there was so much. People were actually getting wealthy for the first time ever. Unfortunately, the president at the time, who was a good man, I think, he listened a little bit too much to Washington and Brussels, and he brought in a lot of advisors and a lot of think tankers and everything, and they crushed this black economy, and it brought under the foot. But the thing is interesting. I think that we're going back to the EU versus the U.S. when it comes to the Balkans. In a larger sense, I think the EU's ace in the hole is Russia, because if the EU is able to get past this, the Russophobia, whatever you want to call it, they're going to have a leg up on the U.S. And here's something that's interesting. We talked about it before the show. I don't know the significance of it other than to think that it must be significant. Angela Merkel, the chancellor, the German chancellor, is in her second meeting with Putin in a month. She's down in Sochi right now, meeting with Putin, Russia's president, second time in a month. And interestingly enough, Deutsche Welle, which is the German government-funded news station, they point out here are the stumbling blocks to better relations between Germany and Russia. Clearly, that's on their mind. Claims that Russia's behind the hacker attacks. Russia's role in Syria. Although, interestingly, remember, Germany didn't join in the bombing. Crimea, that's a dead letter. That's essentially gone. Intelligence agency aggressiveness, the Skripal case. Well, as we've been covering for a while, that's fallen apart. Lack of progress in Ukraine, that's an issue. And also Russia cracking down on German-funded meddling NGOs in Moscow. So that doesn't look like an insurmountable list of things anyway.
No, and maybe we could see this in a positive light that, who would have ever believed there would be a wall coming down in Europe and Berlin in a positive sense and dealing with a Russian dictator, Gorbachev. Yeah. And the tanks didn't roll, and over the decades, when anybody defied him, the tanks rolled in, and there was really a crackdown. So Gorbachev, just said, that's it, it's all over, and it broke down. Maybe Putin is in a position to take it one step further because he's coming across, because what I'm saying is very dangerous. We may get put on a list for saying it, that maybe he is going to be a more decent person to deal with. Maybe they have advanced another step. I don't know if that's true, but I would like to think about it. His actions aren't all that ruthless. I mean, sometimes we're doing a lot more threatening than he is. And so much of what he has done, whether it's in Syria or elsewhere, he's probably closer to following international laws than we have.
Certainly in Syria, that's objectively the case. But here are some other wild cards if we're sort of looking at Europe. I would say the Visegrad 4 countries, which would be Hungary, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Poland. These are countries that the EU has been upset with because, first of all, Hungary, as we know, where they refused to accept all of these refugees, and it turned out that the Hungarian prime minister at the end of the day was right. And not only was he right, he just got elected with a supermajority, so the people liked it. They have never bought into this whole Russia bashing idea. They're obviously they have. They're not jumping into Russia's arms. They remember the years of Soviet occupation, all these things, but they have never really had this reflexive anti-Russia view that I think that the Western European countries had because of U.S. pressure. So these countries are much more interested in opening to Russia. For trade, Hungary does a lot of trade with Russia. It's important trade. So I think that is an interesting wild card when you're looking at how the chips are falling.
And, even under today's circumstances, there has been a lot of fighting and division and attacks on Russia, but they still sell their gas. The gas is still flowing through there. I mean, they could turn all that off. Wouldn't help Russia and wouldn't help the Europeans, but they still, I think what happens is the demagogues in government, ours and elsewhere, and UN does it too, they have to speak to and appeal and appease some of the hardliners. Even Iran has to do that. There'll be hardliners, and they might have to say something. So that is what we hear sometime. But I think the important thing is moving in the right direction. For us as Americans, we should not say, "Oh my goodness, we'll have to wring our hands." The treaty broke down, and we're having all this bad blowback, and now the Europeans don't like us anymore. How horrible! How horrible! Well, maybe we should think about America and think about it in different terms. That friends with people, trade with people, and do this thing. And I always get back. So often we get accused of, you guys just want to be isolationist. No, it's very much intervention, but it's voluntary intervention, and it's a economic intervention where everything is done voluntarily on both sides, and under those conditions, both sides benefit too. This whole idea that whether it's trade policy, one side benefits, the other side suffers. In true free markets and free trade, both sides benefit, and that's why free trade is anti-war. Because in a way, that's why Russia is still selling oil to Europe, because it's beneficial to them. And that's why the European Union is coming out and saying we might even have to defy our protectors, the United States. Maybe we don't need them. Maybe they're getting us into more trouble because we'd sort of like to deal with the Iranians. Yeah, they have their problems, but if we do these trade deals, they're scared to death. Our side's scared to death. We might get to liking them, and benefit from them, and maybe they won't need us so much. And then we wouldn't need to send our troops and weapons over there. Who would buy our weapons? Wouldn't we go broke? Yeah, because that's our industry, the war machine, war profiteering. I think it's all involved, and of course the money issues involvement, the banking industry, and the exports. Unfortunately, when we get involved in here, we want to export them the technology of the IRS, the central banking, and all these horrible things, and we expect them to do it our way, which eventually we'll realize that our biggest export has not been a good export, and that's the exporting of our inflation, exporting our dollars. Although in the short run it benefits, in the long run it destabilizes, and that's why we have these weird fights with China over trade, which never talks about the real issue.
Well, we often talk about unintended consequences from a negative perspective. I think this is one time where the unintended consequences of what we still believe was a dumb idea. Pulling out of the Iran deal was a dumb idea for the U.S. But the unintended consequences, ironically, might end up benefiting the U.S. because it might reduce the U.S.'s ability to bully the rest of the world, which costs the rest of us a lot of money and a loss of prestige, a loss of making enemies overseas. So I think we should be upbeat about this. The other thing that I would just mention is that we've had a real uptick in our viewership and in our subscribership since the Iran crisis and a few of these things, Gaza, etc. We're very happy to all the new viewers who've joined us. Please subscribe to our channel. Tell your friends. Tell your enemies to watch the Liberty Report and subscribe to our channel.
Now, give advice and tell those people who have an enemies list, keep us off that list. We're really nice people. We want peace and prosperity.
That's right.
Nobody can argue about that. And individual liberty, and at the same time, the other side keeps winning because authoritarians have been in charge of government for as long as anybody can write history. But it doesn't mean we can't change our ways. We change our ways all the time. Just think how industrially we have changed our tune with industrial revolutions. The whole nature of the world changes with that. Why can't we change the nature of people getting along together and advance to another stage? So I'm very much of an optimist that we can use our intelligence and our technology for peaceful purposes. I don't like it when we have technology developed and then immediately it's the government that gets control of it and uses against us, invade our privacy or uses it in weaponry to go and tell other people how to live. Technology ought to be used for protecting our privacy and protecting us against government and protecting our liberty. So that is a revolutionary thought. We're not too far into that, but there's no reason why we can't move in that direction, at least if we can state it, that it's a possibility. Mankind can change its ways, and that's what I think we should try to do for positive reasons. And that is very simple. Give up the notion that you should mold the world with authoritarianism, with the use of force, and that things should be done voluntarily. It's not complex. And treat other people like we want to be treated in foreign policy as well. I think it is a road to peace and prosperity. That is our goal. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.
Ron Paul Liberty Report, ronpaullibertyreport.com. Check them out, subscribe. Now, I think the more we distance ourselves from the EU, and the more we can actually make deals with individual countries, I think that will actually help those countries and help to break up the EU, which it needs broken up. The whole immigration crisis that's going on, it's spurred on by the EU. Now, there's individuals like London You can look over in London and know who's kind of pushing that along. But yeah, there's a immigration crisis where they're just not caring really who they get in, because it's about empathy. Well, how about you just open your front door to your house? Just let anybody that doesn't have a home to live in, just let them into your house. But, well, you wouldn't do that, so why would we do that to our countries? That really kind of just goes against everything that I think most people personally believe in, but they can't separate that personal. Sorry, I'm having technical issues if you didn't hear those technical issues. Okay. You wouldn't do that in your personal life, so you can't claim that, oh yeah, you would do it. The country should do that, or all of Europe should do that. It was funny because Paul Joseph Watson had posted a little commentary, and it was a lady over in Britain that was talking about, oh yeah, we as a country just need to let all these people in. And on a morning news, I think it was, they asked her, well, would you be willing to take in, these refugees? And this is someone that has mansions. Oh, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't I? To push the immigration. Well, to this date, she hasn't taken in one immigrant. Of course not. Same way you would just randomly take in random strangers. It just wouldn't happen. But because they live in their mansions in parts of Britain that haven't instituted the immigration. Yeah, there's parts of Great Britain that there's almost zero, if not zero, immigrants in those towns, those locations. And those are the people pushing it. Well, who does that affect? Well, it's not affecting them. Who does it affect? It affects the people that they're trying to rule over. And I'm not for, stopping immigration. I'm for responsible immigration. One, it's harder on a country when they do mass migration. There's so many examples just in American history that because of mass migration, there was 10 to 20 years worth of infighting between groups from different countries. And I'm not talking, the whites and the Asians, or the whites and, other. No, I'm talking about whites and whites. Oh, you're from Germany and you're from Ireland. Oh, I hate you. I mean, it literally takes generations to break that. Because when you mass migrate populations, they don't have to assimilate. The assimilation comes from their kids and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren. But when you look at every time that we'll let some people in from here and some people in from here, we're looking at the individuals, not, let's take a whole bunch of people from Ireland or Syria or Yemen or wherever. When you don't look at groups of people, but you look at people as individuals, and you go, okay, you as an individual seem to be a pretty good person. You've got a history of not causing, violence. You're not someone that's been caught thieving all the time. You haven't been associated with groups that have been violent. Let's just slowly take these people in. They assimilate without losing their culture. Everybody thinks, assimilation means that you just give up your culture. No, you hold on to the good parts of your culture. You hold on to your heritage. But you also remember, hey, I came here because there's something better about this place than where I live. So, a lot of the issues, whether it be government or even a lot of times culture, how many times have people said, I come to America because, the way everything's ran in my country is crap. And then they come here, definitely under mass migration, and they go, yeah, we should have it like this. This is how it was back at home. Well, then why the hell did you come here? Because they weren't doing it right. Well, let's look at, can it be done right? Is there any evidence that holding on to that belief will change just because of location? Or is it the belief itself? And I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about doctrine. Doctrine, whether it be in religion or, government culture. Just like socialism, communism, fascism. Guess what? Plenty of examples of how that shit don't work. So, I think that even though I'm not a nationalist, I think the globalist ways are even worse. And that we need to try to steer away from the globalism, unless you're talking about maybe globalism in the sense that we start breaking down not only the globalist government systems, but the national government systems. That we start adhering to a doctrine that allows for individuals to be free. To a doctrine that says, hey, just because you're offended by something doesn't give you a right to abridge someone else's right. If what they say is so bad, then it should not be too hard for you to come up with a speech to counter their speech. Well, that means I would have to think. Yes, it does. Now, you already have Britain still having a problem with their whole Brexit. But I think that once they fully remove themselves from the Brexit, when they're also, how should I say this? When, Trump or America says you don't have to be a part of the EU to trade with us. Matter of fact, hey, all of Europe, you don't have to come to us through the EU to make deals. Matter of fact, how about we stop talking with the EU and say, hey, France, if you want to come to us, you come to us. I'm not talking to these people that, have nothing to do with your country other than they claim authority over it. I think that's where the fixing of these issues comes into play. And I have another clip to kind of go along with the EU. And I'm not going to play this whole one because it is quite long. But there's really important things that are in this, definitely when it comes to the fall of the EU and how it's falling. It's one of those deals. You see the EU dictate to these countries. Then what happens? The countries blindly go along with it. Or sometimes not even blindly. They within the EU Parliament, they speak out against it, and the EU goes, yeah, we don't care. And they're like, well, son of a bitch, we got to do it then. Then what happens? The people within that country become pretty upset. What does that lead to? It leads to hatred. Not love, hatred. Same thing happens here. I grew up in an era where I grew up with black people, and it wasn't a big deal that a person was black or Hispanic or Asian. Now I'm looking at the generations coming up where it's becoming the complete opposite. Where now I'm actually starting to see racism rise. Well, where the hell is it coming from? It's coming from these old farts that's how they got their money. That's how they got their fame. That's how they got their congressional seats. And that's all they know. So anything that happened, well, it's got to be because they were black. It's got to be because that person's white and they're just racist. Well, yeah, there's racists. But to claim that because someone has a belief that, well, you show respect, well, that's not their culture. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I know history enough to know that the African American community didn't used to be the way it is now. Where did a lot of the violent stuff come from? You had the civil rights era. What happened after the civil rights era? Those same people had to continue to race bait everything because that's all they knew. And you're seeing that today too. I'm not even talking about just, anything to do with the race. You have people that, and I don't want to group a whole bunch of people into this, but there's groups of people that they were told that, you can work hard and you'll probably still have nothing. And it's because of, the rich people. So don't even try to work hard because you're going to be in the same spot you are if you work hard. Then they grew up going, well, government owes me things and rich people owe me things because that's the only way I'm going to ever get it. Just look at Bernie Sanders. His rise in popularity. You're talking about a guy that I don't even think he had a job until he was in his 30s, late 30s, if I remember right. Socialism. Well, you have a guy that literally lived off other people. Most of his job experiences pushing a narrative that people should be given free crap. That your right to free health care is a right. No, you have a right to seek out health care. Government doesn't have a right to tell you what you should and shouldn't do when it comes to health care. But when you claim that, well, government should give it to you for free, that means they have to take that labor from someone else or that money from someone else. Which, guess what? Goes against your actual right to seek out health care. That makes it where, well, it has to be approved health care. What does that lead to? I don't know. Let's look at, Great Britain. And a lot of other European countries that give out free health care and then go, hey, yeah, the chance of your child, living, even if we give them treatment, is not high enough that we're going to do it. So we're just going to let your kid die. And then the last one that died, they literally kind of let it die under very nasty, like feeding tubes and oxygen tubes being not cleaned or wiped. Well, he's dying anyways. Why? Who cares if he gets infection or catches like 3 other things before he dies and suffers the whole time? He's dying, and we're not going to help him because it's too much. Eventually, this is all going to do a 180, but I fear what comes in the process. Because the left in America have a obsession with European ideas. Well, guess what? Fascism, communism tends to be a European ideology. That's something that the left likes to pick up. Free healthcare, all that stuff. Just like this whole royal wedding. I really don't care. Why are we making such a big deal out of it? Who cares? It's a monarchy in another country. What's American actress? Okay. Then explain Diana. It's an obsession. Because they watch too much damn movies. Oh, royal. Oh. No. You want to know what that brings you? Look at the amount of poverty in Europe. You see neighborhoods here in America, and people are like, "Oh, the houses look the same." I'm like, "Well, no, the architecture is a little different, and shapes are a little bit different, colors are a little bit different, but yeah, it's 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom homes, all somewhat similar with different. Look at a lot of places in Europe, literally block houses, literally just little squares. Exactly the same, 4 miles. Zigzagging miles of the exact same thing. Boring. And those people don't have a sense that, hey, maybe I could become something bigger. You have a better chance here in America of creating something for yourself than you do in Europe. People go, yeah, you got to be connected. Yeah, that helps. Definitely helps. But it's not a must here in America. Unless you're a genius or you're connected in Europe, you're probably going to stay about the same. And throughout the years, they've definitely secured that. Now, actually, it's worse because they've literally giving those mass migrants a lot of those houses. Now what do you got? Well, they'll build you some apartments, so don't worry about it. But let me get into this clip here. I definitely want to cover some of this because it is long. I definitely need to kind of get into it sooner than later. So this is fall of the European Union with Janice Atkinson and Stefan Molyneux.
I hope you're doing well. We're here with Janice Atkinson. She is an independent MEP representing the southeast of England and is vice president of the Europe of Nations and Freedoms, ENF group, in the European Parliament. You can find her website at janiceatkinson.co.uk and twitter.com/Janice for Brexit. That's very subtle. You want to know where you stand in that. Thanks so much, Janice, for taking the time today.
Well, you're very welcome, Stefan. I've been a big fan of yours, and hope I can live up to those other Brits that you've had on.
I'm sure you will. Thank you very much, by the way. So the EU, my goodness, it seems almost like, when you push in one side of a balloon, another side comes out. It almost seems like there was this USSR that was a giant disaster. And then when it began to crumble apart and the seams began to show and things began to fall into disarray on the Soviet side, a bunch of bright sparks in Europe said, hey, I bet you we can do it nicely here with the EU. And this kind of collectivism, surmounting of nationalism and so on is an experiment that I think is gone woefully awry. And where do you stand with that perspective?
In 2014, there were 750-odd MEPs elected from across the EU to sit in the Parliament. And those people that are there, you've got this cabal that sits with Merkel, which is the so-called Conservatives, and you've got the Socialists. They're the biggest group, and they do dirty deals together. When I got there, I knew what the EU was about. I'd been over there, I'd sat with British Conservatives, and I was quite disgusted about what I saw. But nothing actually prepares you for when you sit in the chambers and the committees and you listen to them. Our voices are not heard. They've got elections in May 2019. Britain won't be there. But what you've seen is this surge of opposition from all over Europe, from France to Netherlands to Germany to Sweden, all across Europe. There's new political parties that are springing up. There's Neo-Dexia in Greece, left the Conservative Party. There's a new party called Vox, left the Conservative Party in Spain. And so it goes on. You've seen the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, and also the Blue Party, where Frauke Petry, who did lead AfD, has gone. Those people have got massive support. Now, the current makeup of the Parliament doesn't reflect that. And I think in May 19, you're going to see an enormous Eurosceptic elected representatives coming back. You'd also see a surge of the hard left that sits opposite me. We've got communists, you've got the IRA sitting there, disguised as Sinn Féin, disguised as the alt-green hard left. So it's going to be a very, very difficult political makeup. And what you've seen over the past few months is my side, I sit in the European of Nations and Freedom Group, which consists of Marine Le Pen, Geert Wilders, H.E. Stracker, Matteo Salvini. Now, those people are either the official opposition in their countries or they're actually taking power. So you're seeing a vast difference. And what you're seeing at the moment, and especially over Brexit with Monsieur Barnier, who is the head negotiator for the Commission, and Guy Verhofstadt, who's public enemy number one in the European Parliament, my nemesis, is the fight for their existence, because the people are rejecting their policies. And they're not going to go down fighting. That's why you see Brexit doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. The government is all over the place with it. So you're seeing a very, very different shift, and the people are behind either Nexit for the Netherlands, or there's a lot of people in France that want Frexit for France. So you're suddenly seeing this gradual change. We took that brick out of the wall and it's gradually crumbling, I'm glad to say.
Right. Now, my perception of Brexit, Janice, was something like this, that people wanted to control their own borders. They wanted to return to the nation state, at least to some degree, and they wanted control over immigration. As I think you've pointed out, the vast majority of housing is now going to economic migrants, not really refugees and so on. And you have people from the UK armed forces who are sleeping in the street because they can't find a place to live. And that, to me, was the major driver. It's not like people care about the abstract principles of free trade. I mean, people like you and I do, and our friends do, and so on. But the average person was just like, well, my country is kind of shifting underfoot. There's a lot of problems, high taxes, massive overspending, housing crises, educational crises, healthcare crises, because all of these systems were not designed to deal with this massive influx of adults. You know, normally, if you have a bunch of kids, you've got, decades, in a sense, to plan for some of these things, but you don't when people just come surging in. But the perception from the leadership seems to be very different from the urgency, I think, that was felt by the people who voted for Brexit. And that divide, I think, is very dangerous for the country's political legitimacy.
Yeah, of course it is. I mean, Britain's been a very welcome and open country. We've had the British Empire, now the Commonwealth, and we've welcomed people in small groups. But what we had is this vast arrival of nearly 2 million people that we just couldn't cope with. So the schools are underfunded and the schools are overpopulated. And then you've got housing. It's having an economic impact as well. So you're having to build these extra houses. Then you've got the NIMBY saying you can't build on the green belt because that is sacrosanct. And to a degree, that's absolutely right. But we wouldn't have to be having this argument about building on the green belt and funding the extra funding into the NHS and taxes going up if we didn't suddenly have to absorb all of these people. And there's no sign of that stopping. And the people of Britain really cottoned on that 80% of the migrants sitting over in Calais in France are economic migrants. There's very few asylum seekers. There's very few refugees. And you see the narrative in the EU change. They are now refugees. They're not economic migrants. They won't use that word. And also the UN has got a body that's pushing this, that you've got to redistribute all these so-called refugees and asylum seekers. And that's been really sad for the refugees and asylum seekers because, yes, absolutely, we should be welcoming. So should your country, the US and others. But now people have got very, very hard because they can't get their kids into the schools, the preferred schools that they want. They can't afford to get their kids on the housing ladder. Property prices have gone exponentially high because of immigration. Everything comes down to immigration in the end. And we actually can't cope with it. And the rest of Europe are seeing this as well. But it isn't just the housing, the infrastructure, it's the social infrastructure as well. We are having to adapt our culture and our identity to fit in with a small minority of people that are very vocal, very well funded as well by the left and Antifa, and our voices are being shut down. And the ordinary person in the streets since 2014 has really said enough is enough, whether it's in this country or whether it's in France, Germany or wherever. We've seen these 80% of fit young men, and I've been over to Calais a number of times. I've been to the Greek migrant camps a number of times as well. These fit young men have a very different attitude and perception on Western values, our freedom of speech, our way of life, and we have to adapt to them. And we're saying, no, enough is enough. And especially women that have been attacked and raped and sexually assaulted, we're saying, no, enough is enough. And that's trickled down to the rest of the population. Most of the population don't think about free trade agreements. All they want to do is put food on their table, feed their kids, go to Waitrose or Tesco's, whatever supermarket they go to. They're not really worried about free trade agreements. They don't understand that, that's for us and the policy wants to get that. But that's important as well.
Well, and it is a very strange, just one minor correction, my country is Canada, not the U.S., but it is a very strange situation when you look at the macro aspect of things, Janice, which is, so there was, massive transfer of wealth from the first world to the third world, with the hopes, of course, of building up stability in the third world. And generally what happened, particularly in Africa, was the population just exploded, which was the result of, foreign aid payments and other forms of economic transfers. And then the powers that be decided to play Grandmaster chess destructo game with the Middle East, destroying countries like Iraq and I guess attempting to Syria and Libya and so on. And so you send huge amounts of money to swell a population, you bring down the barriers, and then you raise the amount of money that you pay for people to come into your country because it's very expensive having these immigrants come in. This is a sort of perfect storm, or, some might say an engineered disaster that seems to have one particular direction. One of the things that I think a lot of people are asking is, if there is all this instability in the Middle East, if these people are refugees, well, there are many, many countries in the Middle East that have compatible climates, political systems, religions, cultures, and so on. Why on earth would they trek across the Red Mediterranean all the way through Europe to a tiny island on the edge of Europe? It doesn't seem to make much rational sense, which seems to be politics these days as a whole.
Yeah, no, I agree. My country has committed to spend 0.7% of GDP on foreign aid. That's at current prices. That's £14 billion a year. Now, that foreign aid is going to places like China, India. They've got their own space programs. These are phenomenal countries with phenomenal wealth. So absolute madness. And we're funding Africa. Rather than funding Africa and giving them aid, we should actually be trading with Africa. So the EU doesn't allow us to do this. The EU actually keeps Africa in poverty. So if we are allowed to trade with them, then we wouldn't have this problem. We wouldn't have these people. The latest UN and US survey thinks there's 10 million people poised to come out of Africa and slightly through the Middle East as well. So I say to the people in the Middle East, the Afghanis that are here or trying to break into my country, that are holed up in Turkey at the moment and Greece, and the ones that are sitting on the borders ready to raid my country from Calais. If you want to, why do you want to come and impose your Islamic values on my country? Surely there's better countries for you to go to, like Saudi Arabia, for instance. Maybe you don't want to go there. Or you can go to the Middle East. And it's us that's asked to pay out the money the whole of the time, but the Middle East pay very, very little at all. The UAE, the United Arab Emirates, only take in those that actually can contribute to their society. And they are building the infrastructure there, and then they go home. But the immigrants that they've got there are mainly from Pakistan. A lot of them come from India, who are also Muslims. They're working, they're building on the infrastructure. When they're finished, they go home. So I have no problem with immigration, but we have to have the brightest and best around the world to work on the projects that we need. We need the scientists, we need people with mathematical degrees, we need computer scientists. So we bring in the people that we need, not third world migrants that work for a minimum wage or work underneath the economy. And as for the £14 billion worth of foreign aid a year, that came about because David Cameron wanted actually to detoxify the so-called Conservative Party. And he signed up to that. And again, he tried to get some of the EU countries to sign up, but it doesn't stop at £14 billion that is going to these despot regimes. We give money to North Korea, we give people to rogue states like Iran. But on top of that, we actually contribute into the EU funds as well. We have no say how that money's spent, and it goes into providing poverty for Africa and contributing to schools in Pakistan that don't actually exist. So building non-existent schools, putting computers into non-existent schools and educating non-existent students as well. And that's got to stop.
Well, this is the great tragedy of foreign aid as opposed to trade, because foreign aid benefits each individual on both sides of the equation. Trade benefits both individuals on each side of the equation, but foreign aid is basically taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich, powerfully, politically connected people in poor countries, and it is a huge mess. And the suspension, it seems to me, particularly with the refugee crisis, Janice, of the rule of law is quite important. Because if you're a refugee, the moment your foot touches soil, you're not supposed to go anywhere else but that country. It's not supposed to be, who gives out the most welfare and let me make it. So unless somebody's somehow able to go from Africa and sail all the way around to the UK, there should be no refugees arriving in the UK from the Middle East. And so this suspension of the laws that were promised for enforcement is one of the most chilling aspects, I think, that the vast majority of these migrants are, of course, not refugees, and that should be adjudicated. But even if they are, they tend to be welfare shoppers looking for the best deal they can possibly get, or looking to reunite with a community or family members or a tribe or something. And so the EU's rules themselves have been suspended in the distribution of these scant refugees, even as they stand.
Oh, yeah, they've absolutely been abandoned. And at the moment, it's called Dublin II. So a refugee or an asylum seeker has to claim asylum or refugee status in the first country that they arrive in. But that's been abandoned because Greece have moaned and Italy have moaned, well, we can't cope with this. So we did a dirty deal with Turkey. We basically paid them £6 billion to shut the borders and house people. And there was no receipt for that. When I asked the president of the European Parliament, then Martin Schulz, I said, well, have they explained to you how they're going to keep these people, how many people are going to be in the refugee centres, how are we going to process them, etc.? Are we going to provide them with the help to do this? And basically he came back and said to me, well, no, that there's no system for monitoring what they do. We're just giving them £6 billion and we hope that they can contain them, basically corral them. But Turkey have said enough's enough. So the refugees and the migrants are now just streaming back into Europe. Now, if we had implemented Dublin II and we manned our borders, as people like Viktor Orban, who I think is fantastic in Hungary, who's placed troops on his borders and actually put his own borders up. We in my group and the EFDD group, which is Nigel Farage's group, we call for an abandon of Schengen, which is the system which is a free movement of people around the EU. We're not in Schengen, so we don't have the free movement of everybody going around Europe. You still have to come into our country and show a passport. But what you're seeing is they're seeping in through the Balkans, they're seeping in through Italy and Greece, who just absolutely can't cope. And what we're seeing is gun running, prostitution, trafficking, people trafficking. It's not just about economic migrants. They're all trying to make a buck as well. So, the destabilisation of Egypt and Libya with the Arab Spring, where Sarkozy and Cameron thought that, wouldn't it be nice to democratise and get rid of people like Gaddafi and Mubarak. We've now seen an oppressive regime in Libya. Nobody knows who's running it. It's a totally rogue state. And they're all coming out of Africa via Libya. And we can't stop it. Those boats are coming out day after day after day. So what we need to do is man our borders, close our borders, shut the Schengen system down and go back to the rule of law, which was the original rule of law, rather than just saying, oh, dear, it's completely unworkable. We need to have another system. Rubbish. And then the EU says we're going to impose the numbers of migrants on you. Well, there's another crisis coming because Hungary, the Visegrad countries, Poland, etc., said, no, we're not taking any more migrants. And the people now that are voting for parties like the Lega Nord, Matteo Salvini, a friend of mine, he's a vice president of the Europe of Nations and Freedom as well. They're saying no more migrants. We're not having it. We're not accepting them. So there's another crisis coming along where the EU is actually taking on Poland and Hungary at the moment. They're going to have to take on Italy soon, and Sweden will have a general election at the end of the year in September, and they'll have to take them on as well because my friends, the Swedish Democrats, will then be in power. So it goes on. So you have these crises. We'll just abandon our borders. We'll just abandon the rules of Schengen, and this is the result that we have.
Well, and what's really been horrifying to me, Janice, is looking not just at the collapse of the rule of law in many ways, among European countries, particularly those who've taken a lot of the migrants. You have people getting off with probation for rape. You have you've got female genital mutilation problems in the UK, been illegal since 1985, not one single prosecution in any way, shape or form. And then, of course, you have the Rotherham scandals and other scandals wherein you have the Pakistani migrants or immigrants, who are torturing and raping young white British girls. No rule of law there until a real extremity occurs. So you have this kind of abandonment of the rule of law in one area and a real concentration of the power of the state on free speech. I was reading, as I'm sure you have as well, the Sentencing Council for England and Wales drafted changes to public order offences so that if anyone is perceived to be targeting online a protected characteristic, including, this is the quote, race, sex, disability, age, sexual orientation, religion or belief, pregnancy and maternity, and gender reassignment, and punishments can include up to multi-year jail sentences. That is astonishing. There's no proof for this. It's not objective. It's somebody's subjective experience of being offended. And as we've seen with some people, a complaint doesn't even have to be made. The police can just take it on themselves and pursue as they see fit. To call this a chilling effect is like calling the Ice Age a cold snap. And that is one of the gravest things I think that seems to be coming out. The whole idea of diversity was, hey, let's have a big and more rich and more diverse marketplace of ideas. And what is delivered and what is promised is completely oppositional.
Yeah, absolutely. The grooming gang scandal is just a tragedy. 84% of the grooming gangs members are Pakistani men or of Pakistani origin. So we've imported this culture that has total disregard for our way of living, our culture, and Western women, actually. You've got tens of thousands of girls that have been abused, and some boys, actually, as well. And to date, we've only had 156 prosecutions, which is quite a horrific figure. Down in London, you've got Sadiq Khan, as I call him, our mayor, that has now got a task force. So he's employing 5 particular police officers, and he's been given, along with the Home Office, around about 2.5 million to target online hate and speech. So, but what is hate speech? Well, we have to go back to 1997 when the Blair government came in. Both him and his wife are lawyers. They're human rights lawyers as well. So they brought in hate speech and hate crime. But no, it's never really been defined. You know, you can refer yourself to a website called Telma, which is basically a sort of Muslim-run campaign against Islamophobia. But what's Islamophobia? So you can actually ring up and say, I've been terribly hurt by somebody online that said something about me. There's no verification on that, but that goes down as a statistic. And so those statistics are going up and up and up. So in the past few years, we've lost 20,000 police officers in London, but yet Sadiq Khan can find £2.2 million to have 5 officers and others sitting there watching what we're doing online. In the meanwhile, we are the acid capital of the world, the acid attack capital of the world. We've had 63 murders this year. That's an increase of 44%. But you can find time to target people that because somebody feels hurt because you just said, oh, well, you know, transgender doesn't really exist. And even if you cut your balls off and you take some hormones, you know, you can't be a woman. So if I go online and say that, which I do quite often, there are only 2 sexes, that's considered a hate crime. I mean, I haven't actually been targeted yet, but, you know, I'm just waiting for the time. I don't think they're targeting necessarily elected representatives, but lots of my friends have been kicked off online. Shazia Hobbs, who is a former Muslim victim of child abuse, sexual abuse, she's not allowed to go online anymore. But so the money is targeted against those who are perceived of targeting Islamophobia, but there's no money on the other side for ex-Muslims, and there's no helpline for these girls that have been groomed. There's no hotline for them to call to say confidentially that we've been abused, and that's a great tragedy. So you've got billions of pounds being channeled into those who feel oppressed from people that only make up roughly 5% of the population, where we've got tens of thousands of poor working class white girls who have been targeted systematically, raped and abused. And that's got to stop. That's where we are with it.
Oh, it is. really a crazy situation because, of course, England was in many ways the originator of the very idea of free speech. And it's always been my particular argument, Janice, that if you have a good case to make, you should never be afraid of opposition. If your position is solid and rational and moral and defensible and supported by empirical evidence and all kinds of good philosophical bows and wrappings on it, well, seems to me that only people with the very worst possible ideas would be afraid of critical examination, of skepticism, and it is almost like the free speech laws are designed to defend the indefensible, because if it can be defended, you shouldn't need protection from the law.
No, I agree, and it worries me where it's going. Freedom of speech is a democratic right and a democratic society, but it's us that's being closed down. It is the sort of conservative right of free speech. It's been shut down in the European Parliament. Where now, if it's decided by the chairman that's presiding over proceedings, I called Catherine Beard, the last remaining Liberal Democrat MEP, quite mad for some of her proposals. I wasn't allowed to say that. I cut off my microphone. I called Guy Verhofstadt odious. Well, the man is odious. And again, I got a nasty letter from the president. You cannot use this sort of language in there. But if you can't have freedom of expression and freedom online, yes, Twitter does get a bit manic at times, and so does Facebook. But people are saying what they actually are frightened of and in fear of. And if you shut down the free speech, then that's where extremism does come in. They're driven to far right or far left ideology, and everything in the middle and to the right is shut down. And people feel very, very upset and angry over that. And I fear with this sort of social democrat government that we have in power, it worries me because David Davis is the Brexit secretary. And he resigned a few years ago from the Cameron opposition and fought a by-election against 42 days detention. And I went up to his constituency and I ran the campaign up there. I can't hear him now speaking out for free speech. And that's basically what he was saying about sort of civil liberties, liberty, rule of law, etc. There's just this silence across the Conservative bench. And the police are being used as pawns in this as well. We're wasting resources. I think there's about 800 officers now dedicated across the country looking online, armchair coppers, and arresting and shutting down. And you've got Antifa, the far left, targeting certain people, and another group called Hope Not Hate, targeting certain people online, like Shazia Hobbs, who was kicked off Twitter, Tommy Robinson, who's got hundreds of thousands of followers, kicked off Twitter. I might not agree with everything they say, but I absolutely uphold their right to say it.
Well, of course, nobody can arbitrate the marketplace of ideas. That is a form of oligarchical tyranny that has failed repeatedly throughout history, and we lose the feedback that we need to guide ourselves sensibly as a culture. And the other thing, too, I think it's fairly important to point out that nobody with half a brain thinks that all of these hate speech laws are going to be applied evenly across religions and across races. In other words, I see the most egregious hostility towards white people online, rarely policed. I see hostility towards contempt towards Christianity, which is almost never policed as hate speech. So it seems to be some kind of objective law, but the way that it's actually implemented in practice tends to be more protecting those who criticize whites and Christians, and it is not an evenly applied standard at all, from what I've seen.
No, I absolutely agree. When gay marriage was brought in, I went on the BBC's Question Time programme, actually with a gay guy as well. And I was up there to say that the BBC expected me to say, well, I don't believe in gay marriage because I have a strong Christian background, or I'm just opposed to gays getting married. But what they don't realise is that I have no faith, actually. So I'm not interested. But what I was worried about with gay marriage was bringing in the hate crime laws as well. So when a vicar or anybody stands up on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday, depending on their faith, whatever faith you're from, and they stand up and say, no, I think that gay marriage is wrong because they've got 2,000 years of doctrine behind them, I will absolutely stand up for them to say gay marriage is wrong. I don't care if two gay people want to get married. I have no interest in that whatsoever, of shutting that down. But if certain Christian sects say, actually, no, we don't actually believe in gay marriage because of 2,000 years of doctrine. And if the rabbi stands up on a Saturday as well and says the same thing, but they can be arrested. So if you have a priest that stands up in the Catholic Church or the Anglican Church and says that's wrong, there's every chance that they could be arrested. But I'll tell you who they won't be arresting: the imam. When he is saying, yes, we should throw gays off the top of the building, we should stone them to death, this is sodomy, it's Gomorrah, we should not be allowing this, and stone them to death, they will not be arrested. But if anybody else stands up and says that sort of thing, then we're going to be arrested. So it's very, very skewed towards a very small minority inhabiting our countries.
Well, the UK police have confirmed that dislike and unfriendliness can be hate crimes. I mean, let's just call them what they are, which is politically incorrect thought crimes. I mean, that's basically, we're in an Orwellian situation here. So dislike and unfriendliness can be hate crimes, and I wonder if a Muslim refuses to shake a woman's hand, whether he or she will be prosecuted, because that's definitely unfriendly, wouldn't you say?
I've had it. I have had Muslims that have refused to shake my hand, and I've just turned my back and walked around. I said, sir, I don't need your vote. And I've decided to walk away. And the ones that did it actually were born and brought up in this country. So that's a very worrying trend. But if I dislike something, then I dislike it. You know, that's subjective to me. You can't put an objectivity rationale behind that because it doesn't like. You know, if I was told to tell today, I won't say who was in the room, but her daughter had gone to school and she said, I don't like cats, actually. And all the other little girls in that room said, no, you can't say that. What do you mean? That's really nasty to say that, and people will be offended. And the little girl said, why would you be offended if I don't like cats? And the teacher joined in the conversation as well, saying, I think you've taken it a bit far. But what you have is this indoctrination now in our schools and in our public life. And if the parents are not having discussion at home, around the table, we always have political discussions in my house, and my sons can hold their own anywhere. But if you're not having those political discussions about what is right and what is wrong, or just political discussions about life and what you feel about things around the dinner table at home, then I'm afraid that you're leaving it open for the schools to indoctrinate it. So it's state indoctrination when you've got little 6 and 7 year olds saying that it's basically hate crime to say that you don't like cats. That's how far it's gone now. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's
but the good news is the cat doesn't have to lodge a complaint because the police can do it on behalf of the cat and throw you into kiddie prison or something. So, I mean, I grew up in London, England, and to me, the topics that I see coming out of England at the moment are genuinely and foundationally incomprehensible to my youthful experience. So we talked a little bit about female genital mutilation. One case discovered or treated in England every single hour of every single day of every single week, month, and year. And the government has recently logged 1,200 cases of forced marriage. Forced marriage. Now, that's just the logging of them. Full scale of it is not known. So to me, the issue of dealing with things like dislike and unfriendliness being hate crimes, people facing more than half a decade in prison for online activities that are not direct incitements to violence in any way, shape, or form, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, the mass rape of white working class girls that has been going on for decades and only was grudgingly ever prosecuted after social media brought it to light. These things are like peering either through a tunnel of time or into a country that I don't fundamentally recognized from my youth.
Yeah, but I don't fundamentally recognise it either. I grew up half of my life in London. I spent the other half of my life in Kent. So just recently we come back to London. It's not a country that I recognise. It's not a country that the majority of the people recognise. Not one single prosecution for female genital mutilation. We've imported that. The acid attacks in London. Again, that's an importation. That's not something that we've created here. It's importing alien cultures. And so it goes on. But we now have a mayor in charge of London that is more obsessed with an obesity campaign. So that's his latest wheeze today. He's shutting down ads for burgers. You know, when's the last time you see a cheeseburger? Stab anybody. But then he goes on to ban women in bikinis and women that there was a diet pill that was organised. Fantastic body, bikini, are you beach ready? And any normal woman going past that thinking, no, I'm not actually. I won't take your pills, but I'm going to go down the gym. I'm going to not eat that burger, because we've got 2 months. He then shut those ads down. So he's hard on obesity. He's hard on ads like that. He's hard on hate crime. But in the meantime, we've got the acid attacks. We've got the highest number of murders now ever that we've had in our country. But yet the certain populations are just allowed to live their own life and abuse our hospitality, our Western women. Female genital mutilation has been brought in from North Africa. It's a heinous crime. But we still, and at the same time, we have the gender wars. We have the transgender wars, diversity, and that sort of thing. Do you think that these people that are committing these crimes as sexual grooming and a female genital mutilation, they're laughing in our faces all the time that we're distracted in arguing about transgender rights and LGBT rights, etc.? Then all this is going on. You're just distracting resources and just people get more and more angry, and we're not dealing with the real things that we should be dealing with, and we're not targeting our police resources where it should be targeted. Recently, talking about free speech, I intercepted Lauren Southern, a Canadian citizen. She was prevented from coming into the UK along with colleagues of hers, Laura Pettibone, a US citizen, and also Martin Selma. Now, they hadn't even made a speech in the UK, but they were prevented to coming into our country. But we're not preventing the jihadis from coming back. But there's 1,000 jihadi brides that the EU has highlighted that are looking to come back. They've had 5,000 children while they're out in Syria and Iraq. But there's no talk about banning them from coming back in. We've got 500 jihadis that have slipped in back through the country. There's no talk about trying to find them. It's targeting free speech. It's not targeting FGM. It's not targeting the jihadis. We're not shutting down the schools that are teaching the hate of jihadi crime, hating our Western way, hating our women, hating lesbian and gay people. We're not shutting down that in a small minority of the population, but yet they're across the airways, and money, millions and millions of pounds are actually sent to these people like Tell Mama UK, Hope Not Hate, who are just defending a very, very small minority in our country, while the rest of us are crying out for help. Like if you are a victim of a grooming gang, as I said earlier, there is no funding for that.
Well, I think it's pretty clear that everybody in the government is performing appeasement strategies that, throughout history have proven very ineffective. I think everybody's fairly clear that the white Christians aren't going to riot. They're not going to cause a lot of problems. They're going to submit because of historical respect and venerance for the rule of law, and also because they have careers that they wish to maintain and social standing that they wish to maintain. So, the old saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, the most aggressive or most dangerous or group most likely to riot, and this is all over the world, generally tends to get the most concessions and the most law-abiding and the silent majority and so on. You don't really have to factor that into your calculations because you believe that they're not going to do much to protest.
I agree with you, but that's slowly changing. Last Sunday in the UK, we had a day of freedom, day of speech, and 5,000 people attended Whitehall. Quite well-known people that have been kicked off Twitter or Facebook. There was Tommy Robinson, there was Rehan Gassam from Breitbart, there was Shazia Hobbs, a former Muslim, and also this guy called Count Drancula, who was fined for hate speech for £800 a few months ago because he taught his he taught his little pug to do Nazi signals. And let's get that straight, why he did that. And I'm no apologist for him, but he said, everybody loves my girlfriend's dog, and it's the most adorable pug going. But what if I made him do something really heinous, was really horrible? Would they actually hate him? So he taught him to do a Nazi salute. And it was a joke, he did this to show lots of things, actually. But he was then fined £800. So he was a speaker at this event on Sunday. And there was over 5,000 people there. But how did the mainstream media report it? Well, they didn't, actually. There was a sort of clip, the far right are now marching in London. It was also called far right extremists, Nazis, etc. But what I couldn't actually attend it because I was on the plane back from the US, but the feedback I get was people that had never attended a march before, that they were so concerned about what was going on in the country, from grandmothers to young people, they were coming out in support. And then there's another group called the Football Lads Alliance. So they are people across the country that support various football clubs. They're now massing together. There's Veterans Against Violence, and that means jihadi violence as well. So all these groups are suddenly joining up. And there was tens of thousands of them a few months ago when they marched. I can't remember if it was Birmingham or Manchester. And then there's another one planned. And so the mainstream media either report it, and if they do report it, then it's far-right extremists, or it's the football lads, they're far-right, it's the BNP, the British National Party in disguise, this is a resurgence of Nazism and the far-right, we should be very worried about it. But when you actually drill it down and you go and talk to these people, they're ordinary people that bring their families along, their grandmothers who are not online, but come along and grandma and see, and they bring their kids along. So there's a growing movement. And don't forget, when I was elected in 2014, the biggest grouping going to the parliament was UKIP, the Eurosceptic party. So we dominated that. We're not the Conservatives of number one. And at the moment, there's a sort of crisis in our politics. There's a two-party state. There's smaller parties that have emerged, but they'll never get elected because we've got a first-past-the-post system, just like the US, and I think to a degree you've got it in Canada as well. So it's a winner takes all. So there's this sort of battleground at the moment where we've got to win. And if we don't win, we're lost. But I do have a hope for the future. When I looked at what happened at the Day of Freedom on Sunday, we got Trump in the White House, and the massive support that he's got across the country because he's stuck to the policies that he promised. And he's not having any truck with extremists and jihadis and foreign aid and what's happening with Iran with the nuclear deal. He is going to build that wall. And that's brilliant. And you see this all across Europe. So I do have some hope, but all we have is sort of Teresa the Appeaser in Downing Street. Nobody knows what she stands for. And quite frankly, it needs a figure like a Trump, a Putin even, or a Margaret Thatcher and Reagan type of person to come forward and say, this is what I believe in. These are our British values, because at the moment we don't know what British values are. When Lauren Southern was ejected from the UK, I got her to come to we rescued her from Calais and we got her to come to the European Parliament. And I said, but why were you arrested? Well, I was arrested under Section 7 of the Terrorist Act. I said, well, what does that mean? Well, it means I can be detained, I can be deported. And we need a leader that's come out of Britain now, just like a Trump, and say, right, this is what we stand for. These are the British values. Because when Martin Selner was ejected a few weeks ago, they also said, you don't comply with British values. But people are now asking, what are British values? It isn't ejecting nice European, nice American, nice Canadian people like that who have got an enormous following. This Defend Europa, the identitarian movement, is enormous. So what we need in this country is somebody to say, yeah, these are our British values. These are our European values, which are not the same as EU values. And this is what we stand for. Whether it's low taxes, high taxes, but just be honest with the people and lay out your red lines, just like Trump did, and then get into power and start delivering it. Wow, we've got somebody like Trump in America that's actually delivering on their promises. And that's what they hate. And that's why he's so hated, actually. It isn't about him. It's the rest of them scratching their head thinking, oh, my God, we've now got to live up to this. So I am hopeful. That we can change things, because I think we're at a tipping point. We're at a tipping point in the EU, a tipping point in Europe. You're at that tipping point because you've got that cretin Trudeau that's running your country, which is, I think, being outside of your country, he's an embarrassment to you on the world stage. Hopefully you've got another Stephen Harper soon, and that will work. But people must look at him in Canada and think, oh, wow, we've got to get rid of this guy. Because
Harper was a very open borders guy when it came to immigration. So it may be the challenge. And, with regards to Theresa May, I mean, boy, a more half vertical pile of spineless pudding when it comes to negotiations could scarcely be imagined. And this, of course, is the great frustration, is people poured time, effort, energy, resources. They burned relationships. They threatened their own professional success by really working hard for Brexit, which had a lot to do with, of course, borders, control over immigration. And it is funny that people who want borders are called Nazis. If I remember my history correctly, Nazis not so very big on borders because they liked walking across them with a whole lot of panzers in various countries. So, yeah, wanting borders, kind of the opposite of being a Nazi. But the hope was, of course, that they could regain control over the country through Brexit. And now Brexit is like a slow walk into a foggy nothingness. And I think that is a very risky thing because people say, okay, well, we really tried the political approach. And if the political approach genuinely doesn't work, what's next? What they're uncorking could be very, very dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I think the polls show now that across Remainers and Leavers, they just want the government to get on with it. The government isn't prepared. They say, well, business isn't prepared. We need to stay in a customs union or a form of customs union. If we stay in any form of customs union, which is being touted this week, then we can't do free trade deals across the world. We've got the Commonwealth lining up. Even Trudeau wants a free trade deal. Trump definitely does. I was in Washington at Christmas and I met Secretary of State Wilbur Ross, who's Secretary of State for Commerce. And he said there was other European leaders in the room. And I said to him, will you re-explain what the special relationship means to my European colleagues here? And he said, I tell you what it means. You're our greatest ally. He said, these people in this room, they don't get free trade. They don't understand. You're a protectionist racket. And he said, Janice, if you want a free trade deal, you can't take the bitter pill that the EU is offering you. So, when you've got President Trump lining up, got Australia, the Commonwealth countries, all saying we want to have a free trade agreement with you, and then it's being blocked at the centre of our government. And people are getting really, really angry with that because they do actually recognise that, we can trade. They don't maybe get the concept of free trade agreements, but they do recognise that we can have cheaper imports from the US and Canada and beef, all products from around the world, and India as well. Great trading partnership, and China, but we can't because we're constrained. So we cannot stay in a customs union. They've also fleeced our fishermen as well. We used to have a great fishing fleet in this country, which has been decimated because of the common fisheries policy. Now, one of the things that swung the vote was the fishermen coming out from ports all around the UK and sailing up the Thames to Parliament saying we want our fishing rights back. And we've seen that industry decimated. It can't be handed on to the next generation. They can only fish for quotas, but the Spanish can just walk in and take their quota, which are enormous because that's all been negotiated away. The French can't. So we need to take back control of our waters. And that's not on the table at the moment. And so the government is walking a very, very, very tight line here. The Treasury is purposely, because he's a Remainer, the Chancellor, he has not made any contingency plans or any budgets whatsoever for a no-deal scenario. So we just walk away. The negotiations won't work. There's a 1 in 5 chance of that happening at the moment. We walk away and we go to World Trade Organization rules. He's made no provisions for that whatsoever. You've got the Department for Trade, Department of International Trade, headed up with the great Liam Fox, actually, a true Brexiteer and a true friend of the US and Canada. Now, his department this week, their priority should be negotiating trade deals. But this week, they've decided that LGBT is their priority and that they're going to be the greatest trans and LGBT champion across Whitehall. No, nobody's interested. Canada's not interested at the moment whether, we're treating our gays, lesbians, transsexuals in the right way in a Whitehall department. And this is the sort of the problem that we're coming up. And then you've got the House of Lords, this anarchic, unelected body that 12 times in the past few weeks have said, we can't Brexit like that, because the Lords has been stuffed full of people, of cronies from David Cameron and Nick Clegg and the Labour Party as well. So we don't have a majority in the Lords. Now, if Theresa May wants to grow a pair, she should create 100 new peers, put them in the House of Lords, and then we can deliver the Brexit that we all voted for. And she's going to have, if the we had some local elections a couple of weeks ago where the Conservatives did quite well. They were expected to be constituencies. They weren't. So you found the UKIP vote, the Leaver vote, whether they were Labour or UKIP from Conservative, going back to the Conservative Party. And that was a strong message to her to say, deliver Brexit. And if she doesn't, then there's going to be, I think, civil unrest, there'll be a lot of upheaval. And I think the Conservative Party will be out of office again for a generation, as they were in 1997.
Yeah, by which time demographics will virtually ensure that they will never get back in. So the last point I wanted to make, I wanted to get your thoughts on this, because I know that you were an entrepreneur before you became a politician. You ran a marketing business for 2 decades because, of course, you started when you were 12. Now, I have noticed this kind of pattern among people. I mean, if you look at yourself, you look at other politicians, particularly Trump, if you've actually been in the business world, if you've actually had to run a business, if you've actually had to hire people in the remnants of the free market, if you've actually had to manage taxes and regulations on the receiving end rather than on the passing end. I myself was an entrepreneur in the software field for 15 years before I started doing this. There does seem to be kind of a divide among politicians. Have you ever had a real job? Have you ever been responsible for payroll? Have you ever struggled to build something from nothing? Or have you kind of floated from privilege to privilege, from school to community organizer to politics and so on? Have you ever been, say, I don't know, a part-time drama teacher as opposed to somebody who actually runs a business? Do you think that there is something in this hypothesis that if you really want to understand how the market works, it's really a good idea to have participated in some meaningful way prior to getting into office?
Oh, absolutely. I have lots of young people that come and work for me as interns. And over the years, I want to go into politics, Janice. I said, go and get a real job first. Go and do something in the real world. Go into business, become a nurse, a doctor, anything. Go and work in the charity sector. I don't care. But just get experience of life. And when you're over 35, then decide to go into politics. Because what we're seeing, which in the whole Labour Party and to a degree the Conservative Party and certainly the Liberal Democratic Party, none of them have had a proper job. They've all gone from elite schools to elite universities to working in the European Commission, working for an MP, a Member of Parliament, and then they have been chosen to go in. And I was part of David Cameron's A-list. I hated that. And I wasn't one of the preferred women because I was a pain in the neck to him, and I wasn't allowed to talk about Europe. I wasn't allowed to talk about immigration. I wasn't allowed to talk about schools, etc. I had to stay on message. And when after the 2010 election, I fought an election in a 15% Muslim demographic constituency, I left and joined UKIP because at least there I found people of like mind. They had proper jobs, they'd run businesses, or they'd been in professions. They were doctors, dentists, nurses, teachers, etc. So if you haven't had experience of life, you can't tell other people how to run those. It's all very theoretical. And then, last word on the EU. The woman that's in charge of trade policy is a woman called Cecilia Malmström. She's Swedish. She's unelected. She spent her life as a sociology lecturer. That woman is now in charge of international trade. And so it goes on. There's another one who's in.
I'm going to stop it right there. It goes on. Check it out, Stefan Molyneux on YouTube. The title of that one is The Fall of the European Union with Janice Atkinson and Stefan Molyneux. Just to kind of really hit on right there at the end what they were talking about. I'm a shift supervisor and production supervisor right now. But I've been in other supervising positions. And really, the people that I've had the most problem with tend to be college graduates that didn't work through college. They only, took out big, huge, school loans that paid for everything. Maybe mommy and daddy, also gave them some money. Never worked through college. and all they had is theories that they were taught in college. I've gotten rid of more college graduates than I have high school dropouts. That should say something. That should say something about our education system when it comes to our universities. Really great at teaching theories, not great at teaching real life situations. The college graduates can come up with 1,000 ideas. Absolutely no idea of how to put those ideas into action. Part of that's because most of their ideas sound good, but they're not practical. They don't work in real world situations. And that's what really gets me. Now, I really feel that the EU, that flip's going to come. But what I think what I fear once they're able to shed the globalist EU is hardcore nationalists. And the problem I have with the hardcore nationalist is what they always claimed Ron Paul to be, which he wasn't. He's a non-interventionist, but he's not an isolationist. If you get too nationalist of a person, you're going to have an isolationist. And that's the one thing I fear. Now, if we can find people that, even though they want to get back towards a more national government, but can also bring the ideology of individual freedom to it, that will prevent those hardcore nationalists. Hardcore nationalists will isolate a country and they will go after any dissent. And that would be my biggest fear. Now, I think there's quite a few people that are part of the Brexit that were also people that had spoken out in support of ideas that Ron Paul espoused during his, candidacy for 2008 when he was running for the Republican position to be candidate for president back in 2008. And I hope that those people aren't gone before they can fully implement a Brexit. But again, like Janice was saying, there are a lot of people within powerful positions that are preventing the Brexit from going forward, making up excuse after excuse after excuse. Well, we can't pull out quite yet because we'll mess everything up. No, the simple fact that you haven't pulled out yet is messing everything up, is continuing to screw your country over. Theresa May needs to be gone. You absolutely need to get rid of her. And, throughout that clip there, that interview, there's a lot of similarities with the U.S. and what's going on over in Europe. And again, that goes back to these leftists, these globalists. They're not just pushing that ideology in America. They're pushing it throughout the whole Western world. And you think that's going to mix well with the Muslim immigrants? And then let's go even here to America. There, in Mexico and in South America, there is a large Catholic following. I think that's why the Pope is really came in. I'll talk about Israel, Palestine next Wednesday. Stay tuned here on UCY.tv.